The Game of Shadows. It began with an envelope. No return address, no postage, just a plain, black envelope left on the doorstep of every house in the small, quiet town of Ravenswood. Inside was a single card, its edges embossed with silver, bearing a chilling message written in an elegant script. You are cordially invited to play the Game of Shadows. Attendance is mandatory. The stakes are high. The rewards are unimaginable. The game begins at midnight. Instructions will follow. Most of the town's residents dismissed it as a prank, another Halloween stunt aimed at spooking the kids. But for the teenagers of Ravenswood, the message held an inexplicable pull, like a magnet drawing them closer to something they didn't understand. Each of them found themselves holding the card longer than they intended, their fingers lingering on its cold, smooth surface, their eyes drawn to the bold black lettering as if it were alive. Ellie Carter was no exception. At 17, Ellie was known for her quick wit and skepticism, but the card unsettled her in ways she couldn't explain. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at it, her stomach twisting with a feeling she didn't want to name. Her best friend, Marcus, had texted her immediately after finding his own invitation. "Marcus, did you get one of these weird black envelopes? What do you think it's about?" "Yeah." "Feels creepy. Probably some joke, right?" Marcus, "Meet me at the park at 11:30. Let's see what's going on. Bring yours." Ellie hesitated but eventually agreed. She didn't know why, but something about the invitation compelled her to follow its instructions. It wasn't fear, it was curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, something she couldn't yet put into words. The park at 11:30 was eerily quiet. Ravenswood was always a sleepy town, but tonight the silence felt unnatural, as though the world itself were holding its breath. A heavy mist had rolled in, blurring the edges of the streetlights and muffling the sounds of the few cars that passed. Ellie found Marcus waiting near the swings, his card in hand. "You actually came," Marcus said, his voice low, a mix of relief and unease. Ellie shrugged. "Didn't want you to get dragged into something stupid by yourself." Others began arriving. Fellow students from school, some familiar, others Ellie had only seen in passing. Each held their own card, their faces a mixture of excitement, confusion, and apprehension. By midnight, there were 15 of them, standing in a loose circle under the dim glow of the park's flickering lights. And then it began. A deep, resonant chime echoed through the park, like the tolling of a massive bell. The mist thickened, curling around the group like a living thing, dampening their clothes and clinging to their skin. Ellie's breath caught as shadows began to move within the fog, long and distorted, their shapes unrecognizable but distinctly human. The shadows spoke. Their voices overlapped, a discordant symphony of whispers and murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Welcome, players." The teenagers froze, their cards trembling in their hands. Ellie gripped hers tightly, her pulse pounding in her ears. "You have been chosen to play the Game of Shadows. To refuse is to forfeit is to lose." "What the hell does that mean?" Marcus hissed, his voice shaking. No one answered. The shadows moved closer, their forms becoming clearer but no less horrifying. They were tall and thin, their limbs unnaturally long, their faces featureless, save for glowing white eyes that pierced through the fog. "The rules are simple," the shadows continued. "You will face 3 challenges. Each challenge must be completed before dawn. Only those who succeed will survive. Remember, the shadows are watching." Before anyone could react, the ground beneath them began to shift. The park dissolved, replaced by an expansive, labyrinthine landscape shrouded in darkness. Massive stone walls rose around them, their surfaces slick with condensation. The air was thick and cold, carrying the faint metallic scent of blood. "What's happening?" A girl named Tara cried, her voice echoing off the stone. Ellie clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay calm. "We need to stick together. Whatever this is, we're stronger as a group." But the group was already breaking apart. Panic spread like wildfire, some running blindly into the maze, others dropping their cards and curling into themselves, refusing to move. "The first challenge begins now," the shadows intoned. "Find the light before it is extinguished." In the distance, a faint, flickering glow appeared, like the flame of a candle. Ellie exchanged a glance with Marcus, her heart racing. "We go together," she said, grabbing his arm. "No splitting up." "Agreed," he replied, his voice steadier than she expected. The two of them moved cautiously through the maze, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the damp ground. The light seemed to shift and dance, never staying in one place for long. Behind them, Ellie could hear the distant screams of the others, some shrill and panicked, others cut off abruptly. "What happens if we don't find it?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Ellie didn't respond. She focused on the light, pushing forward even as the walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing bolder and more tangible. One of them brushed past her, its icy touch sending a jolt of terror through her body. Finally, they reached the light, a small, flickering lantern suspended in midair. Ellie reached for it, her fingers brushing the cold glass, and then the shadows attacked. Ellie's fingers barely grazed the glass of the lantern when a surge of cold air struck her, nearly knocking her off her feet. The shadows swarmed around her and Marcus, their movements chaotic and frenzied, as if enraged by the light's proximity. Ellie pulled her hand back instinctively, her heart pounding in her chest. "Grab it!" Marcus yelled, his voice cutting through the noise. With a surge of determination, Ellie lunged forward and seized the lantern's handle. The instant her fingers closed around it, the shadows recoiled, hissing like steam escaping from a boiling kettle. The light within the lantern flared, illuminating the immediate area and revealing the twisted, nightmarish shapes of the shadows. They were humanoid, but grotesquely distorted, their elongated limbs and eyeless faces writhing in agony under the lantern's glow. "Run!" Ellie shouted, pulling Marcus by the arm as the shadows began to regroup. The two sprinted through the maze, the lantern's light flickering wildly with each jarring step. The walls around them seemed to shift and twist, the maze reconfiguring itself in real time. Ellie's breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs burning as she pushed herself forward. Behind them, the shadows pursued, their hisses growing louder, their forms stretching and distorting to fill the narrow corridors of the labyrinth. The light from the lantern seemed to hold them at bay, but the flame inside was shrinking, its warm glow dimming with every passing second. "What happens if it goes out?" Marcus asked between gasps, his face pale. "We don't let it go out," Ellie replied, though she didn't know how to stop it. The maze opened suddenly into a large circular clearing. At the center stood a stone pedestal, its surface etched with strange symbols that pulsed faintly in the lantern's light. Ellie slowed to a stop, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. "This has to be part of the challenge," she said, stepping cautiously toward the pedestal. Marcus hung back, his gaze darting between the shadows that lingered at the edge of the clearing and the lantern in Ellie's hands. "What do we do with that thing?" he asked, nodding toward the pedestal. Ellie examined the symbols, running her fingers over the cool, smooth stone. The symbols seemed to shift under her touch, rearranging themselves into a coherent pattern. At the center of the pedestal was a shallow depression, perfectly sized to hold the lantern. "I think it goes here," Ellie said, placing the lantern in the indentation. The moment the lantern settled into place, the flame inside flared brightly, filling the clearing with a blinding light. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke as the light consumed them. Ellie shielded her eyes, barely able to look directly at the glowing pedestal. When the light faded, the maze had changed again. The walls were lower now, the pathways clearer, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. Ellie and Marcus stood in silence, catching their breath as they tried to process what had just happened. "That was insane," Marcus muttered, his voice shaky. "What kind of game is this?" Ellie didn't answer. Her mind was racing, replaying the events of the past hour. The shadows, the maze, the lantern. None of it felt random. There was a purpose behind it, a logic she couldn't yet grasp. A low, guttural voice broke the silence, echoing through the maze. The first challenge is complete, but every victory comes at a price. Ellie's stomach dropped. What does that mean? She whispered. Before anyone could answer, the pedestal began to crack, splitting apart as black smoke poured out from its center. The smoke coalesced into a figure, tall and humanoid, but featureless and utterly devoid of light. Its presence was suffocating, the air around it growing cold and still. To succeed in the game of shadows is to sacrifice, the figure said, its voice a hollow, reverberating growl. Your survival comes at the expense of another. The clearing shifted, the walls of the maze pulling back to reveal a horrific scene. Several of the other players were sprawled on the ground, their bodies motionless, their faces twisted in expressions of fear and pain. Ellie felt bile rise in her throat as she realized that these were the screams she had heard earlier, cut short as the shadows had claimed their victims. No, Marcus said, shaking his head. We didn't do this. It wasn't us. The figure turned its faceless head toward them. Every decision in the game carries a consequence. For every light preserved, a shadow must fall. You chose to take the lantern. They chose to run. Ellie's knees buckled, and she dropped to the ground, the weight of the figure's words pressing down on her. This isn't fair, she whispered. We didn't know. Ignorance does not absolve you of responsibility, the figure replied. The game continues. The next challenge awaits. Before either of them could respond, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the faint smell of ash. The maze shifted again, the walls closing in and reshaping themselves into an even more labyrinthine structure. Ellie looked at Marcus, her hands trembling. This isn't just a game, she said. It's a trap, and I don't think we're meant to win. Marcus nodded, his jaw clenched. Then we need to stop playing by their rules. The maze had never felt more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in around Ellie and Marcus, their dark, slick surfaces towering overhead like silent sentinels. The air was thick, almost unbreathable, and the faint echoes of the other players' screams lingered in the background, as if the maze itself was alive, replaying their suffering. Ellie gripped Marcus's arm, her knuckles white. We can't keep running, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. This game isn't about survival, it's about control. What do you mean? Marcus asked, his voice taut with fear. She took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. The shadows, the challenges, they're testing us. They're forcing us to make choices that pit us against each other. It's not just a game, it's a manipulation. Marcus looked around, his brow furrowed. If that's true, then what do we do? If we don't play, we die. If we do play, we... He trailed off, his gaze flickering to the memory of the bodies they had seen. Ellie swallowed hard, her resolve hardening. We break their rules. As they pressed deeper into the maze, the ground beneath their feet began to change. The once solid stone turned into soft, yielding earth, and the air grew colder. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through their bones. Ellie stopped abruptly, holding out an arm to halt Marcus. Ahead of them was another clearing, this one vast and illuminated by a cold, silvery light that seemed to come from nowhere. In the center stood a massive obsidian obelisk, its surface carved with intricate patterns that pulsed with a faint, eerie glow. Surrounding the obelisk were the remaining players, some standing, others kneeling, all staring at it as if entranced. The shadows encircled the clearing, their forms more solid and menacing than before. Their glowing white eyes seemed to watch Ellie and Marcus intently, as though daring them to enter. "What is this?" Marcus whispered. Ellie's heart pounded as she took in the scene. The players weren't moving. They were transfixed, their eyes blank, their bodies stiff. The obelisk pulsed, the patterns shifting and changing, almost alive. The final challenge has begun, the shadows intoned in unison, their voices resonating like a thunderclap. Only one may claim the light, the others must fall to darkness. Ellie's breath hitched. The players began to move, slowly at first, then with purpose. They turned toward the obelisk, their faces void of emotion, their movements mechanical. One by one, they reached out toward the obelisk, their hands trembling as they touched its surface. The first to make contact screamed. The sound was raw, inhuman, and cut off abruptly as the player crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The others hesitated but continued, as if compelled by an unseen force. Ellie grabbed Marcus's arm. "We can't let them touch it. Whatever that thing is, it's killing them." Marcus looked at her, panic in his eyes. "What do? We can't stop them." Ellie's mind raced. The obelisk was the center of the game, the source of the Shadow's power. If they were going to end this, they had to destroy it. But how? The lantern. Her gaze dropped to the lantern still in her hand, its light dim but steady. It had protected them before, driven back the shadows. Maybe it could destroy the obelisk. "I have an idea," she said, her voice firm. "We use the lantern." Marcus's eyes widened. "Are you sure? What if it doesn't work?" Ellie hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "It's our only chance." The two of them stepped into the clearing, the shadows immediately shifting toward them. The remaining players froze, their heads snapping around to stare at Ellie and Marcus with hollow, lifeless eyes. "Stay close," Ellie whispered, gripping the lantern tightly. The shadows surged forward, their forms coalescing into a solid mass that loomed over the clearing. Ellie lifted the lantern, its light flaring brighter in response. The shadows hissed, retreating slightly, but they didn't disperse. Instead, they circled the clearing, watching, waiting. Ellie and Marcus reached the obelisk. Up close, its surface was even more unsettling, the carvings writhing and shifting like living things. The pulsing light within seemed to react to their presence, growing stronger, more erratic. "Do it," Marcus urged. "End this." Ellie took a deep breath and raised the lantern. Its light grew blinding, a brilliant white that cut through the clearing like a knife. The shadows screamed, their forms unraveling into wisps of smoke as the light engulfed them. The obelisk pulsed violently, cracks forming along its surface. Ellie placed the lantern at its base, the light intensifying as the obelisk began to fracture. A deafening roar filled the air, the ground trembling beneath their feet. The players collapsed, their bodies limp but alive. The shadows disintegrated entirely, their cries fading into silence. And then, with one final pulse, the obelisk shattered. When Ellie opened her eyes, the maze was gone. She and Marcus stood in the park where it had all begun, the faint glow of dawn breaking on the horizon. The other players lay scattered around them, groaning as they regained consciousness. "It's over," Marcus said, his voice thick with disbelief. Ellie nodded, her grip on the lantern loosening. The light inside flickered one last time before fading completely. She set it down, its surface cold and inert. The town was quiet again, the shadows gone, but Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something remained. The obelisk, the game, the shadows. They had been too deliberate, too calculated. Whatever force had created them might still be watching. "We ended the game," Marcus said, as if trying to convince himself. Ellie glanced at him, her expression grave. "For now." As the sun rose over Ravenswood, Ellie couldn't help but wonder, was the game of shadows truly over, or had they just played the first round?